Deus, nos salutaris nostre, Domine ex Deus, ex Deus, ex Deus, Deus noster, Domine ex Deus, Angeli, Ave Patri, Laudem Domino Majestatis,
Hey, how's everybody doing? Hope you're having a fantastic day. It is Monday, August 11th, and we have a fantastic video for you tonight. This week, I have a litany of different topics, but I'm trying to wrap a few things up this week, trying to move past for a bigger project that I have moving forward. And tonight, what I wanted to do is I wanted to wrap up a bit of a saga, a back and forth that I had with the Diamond Brothers at Vatican Catholic, because they have claimed that the teaching of the Second Vatican Council concerning natural acts of religion, the idea that somebody is able to, through the understanding of nature, able to come to a certain knowledge of God, and then due to this, able to make certain acts of worship towards God insofar as they know him by nature. So they've done a response to at least my exegesis of John chapter 4. I posted a lengthy reply on this on Twitter, and they've unblocked me. They unblocked me from Twitter and responded to it. Now, I've been blocked by the Diamonds, by the Vatican Council Real, by the Vatican Catholic Twitter account, probably since I was a Protestant. It's been a very long time. It's been years. But they unblocked me at one point to send me a DM saying, "Hey, Wagner, we actually think you're like the worst, the best of all of the Novus Ordoites, Vatican fake counterchurch, Vatican II counterchurch Catholics. We think a lot of what you do is actually kind of okay, but you're a heretic and you need to become my version of a sedevacantist, Feeneyite, weird synthesis, end times thing." So they complimented me. They said that I was awesome. So I appreciated that. I tried to reply, but they had quickly reblocked me, unfortunately. But they unblocked me recently. They unblocked me. They did a response to my tweet, and then I replied to their response. I was actually on my way. I was on my way to the hospital when I replied to their response. Everything's fine with the whole hospital thing, but I was on my way to the hospital with the reply thing. You know, I just couldn't help myself. I was like, it was like Christmas morning for me. I was so excited that the Diamonds replied to my tweet. They unblocked me on Twitter. You know, I just knew that I had to reply. You know, it doesn't matter if you got to go to the hospital. The Diamond Brothers replied to your tweet. You better lock in and reply, okay? So that happened. And I replied, gave, I think, substantive responses. They replied to me, but in their reply to me, they said that this is the end, this is over, this is it. We're not going to be having any more back and forth. So everyone calling for a debate between Peter Diamond and I, unfortunately, that is not going to happen. Remember, for all of those Diamondites saying, "Oh, why won't you debate Vatican Catholic, Wagner? Why won't you debate them?" Remember when Deuterocomical and I did a stream probably about 9 months ago, I would say. We did a stream somewhere between 6-9 months ago, maybe a year. We said, both of us, that there were topics, and we explicitly said these topics. We looked into the camera and said, we will debate Peter Diamond on these issues. Or I think for Deuterocomical, it was Michael Diamond. We will debate you on these issues, okay? We got no reply, no response, and no debate acceptance. But they said that when it comes to the public connection, the public back and forth between Vatican Catholic and I, that it's over with, okay? He said, you can choose to reply, but we're not going to respond. So rather than doing a tweet response, what I wanted to do is I wanted to do a live stream response. It gave me a day or two to look through a bunch of stuff. Actually, I didn't do it yesterday. Don't work on Saturday, okay, guys? Do not work on Saturday. But today I went through a lot of the commentaries on John 4 that I ordinarily use. And what I saw is exactly what I said in the first place, okay? Because basically what you have is with a lot of these commentaries on John 4, when they're discussing the worship of the God, which you do not know, or the unknown God of Acts 17, when they're interpreting these texts, you see that these commentaries rhyme. They almost all say the exact same thing. They basically say they had mingled the worship of the true God with the worship of idols. That's what the Samaritans did. That's the first point. The second point is they had false notions of God. And the third point is that they had worshiped God in a way that was not in accordance with the divine cultus, which had been established for the Jews. These are the 3 points that are routinely made at almost, I wouldn't say almost every single one, but for a lot of them, that is exactly the different points they make when they're interpreting John chapter 4. But it's that first point that's very important. It said they mingled the worship of the true God, and these are a lot of the quotations I was bringing against them. So they mingled the worship of the true God with the worship of false God, the worship of idols, or the worship of certain imaginary beings from those false notions that they had of God. And what the diamonds will do is they will very selectively quote those texts, okay? What they'll do is they will look at those texts and they will emphasize the aspect that says that it was mixed with false gods or that it was mixed with the worship of idols, and therefore it can be said to be false. And they'll say, well, look at this. It says that it's mixed with the worship of false idols. Therefore, they're not worshiping the true God. It says in the text that they are mixing the worship of God with idols. To give an analogy, let's say that there was a man who was an adulterer, and he both obviously was, had a relationship with his wife, and then he had a relationship with all these other women. If you had this person, they had a relationship with their wife, and they mingled this relationship with other women, does that man have a relationship with his wife? Yes. Any normal reading of that statement would say yes. If he mingles his love with other women, then therefore he still has a relationship with his wife. The love towards his wife, it's a false love, of course, in the same way as because the institution of worship when it comes to other religions, these are not instituted by God, and therefore they are superstitious. Therefore, in that sense, we can call it false worship. But these are still acts of worship towards God. Okay? And it's very obvious once we get into all of the different texts, once we're actually studying the text, okay? And I gave you a lot of variety. You guys are going to love it. I gave a variety of texts, the patristic period, medieval texts, and post-Reformation texts, commentaries on John 4. We're going to see is this is very clear. It's a very simple question. And it's only through a selective reading and a selective quoting of text that you could come to the Diamondite solution. And it's interesting, Kevin from Since 33, because he was included in this video as well, he actually DM'd me when this video came out. I was streaming when the video came out. He DM'd me and he said, what are they doing? They literally quoted texts that refuted them. Because when you look at the quotations they give of Lapide, the quotations explicitly mention the fact that they were mixing the worship of God with idols. Or you look at the text that they gave from St. Thomas, St. John Chrysostom, from Lapide. In the reply that they give to me on Twitter, it says the exact same thing. It says that they mix the worship of the one true God with idols. That's what these texts say. You can try to cope about it. You can try to get around it, but that's just what they say. And you can't interpret one portion of a sentence of a text apart from the other. It's like if I said, I like red and blue, and then you use the fragment, I like red, to prove that I don't like blue. It makes no sense. So this is what we're going to see. We're going to actually get into it. I've been yapping for enough for an introduction. Okay, I gave you a little slideshow. I know that you guys love the slideshows. And by the way, this is probably going to be my last in the... I know that some of you guys have said that you're getting a little tired of the Diamondite saga. A lot of people were asking me to do this video. So I kind of wanted to do a last stage for a while. Maybe I'll move on to other things. Maybe I'll start getting back on the Protestants case, or maybe getting on the Orthodox case. I don't know. But for recently, for some reason, I've been getting on the Feeneyite case. So this is about John 4 and the worship of God. And these are the various different texts. I was paraphrasing them when I was stating them in my monologue in the beginning. But the text that I gave in this initial response, what they stated is that the Samaritans mixed the worship of God with the worship of idols and without divine institution. So when you look at without divine institution, we're going to see this from Pius II. We're going to see this from Cajetan. We're going to see this from a lot of different authors. We're going to see this from St. Thomas. Divine institution, it's very important to this question. And a lot of people, actually the Diamonds kind of get to this a little bit, but they don't really understand the full import of this. Because there are two types of sin against worship. And really, superstition is kind of a genus, but I'm talking about in terms of a special sin. We have the sins of superstition and the sins of idolatry. When it comes to idolatry, this consists in worshiping something which is not God. Whether you're worshiping a creature, so let's say you're worshiping a fish. If you're worshiping a fish, and speaking of fish, I actually finally got a bluegill in my tank. But if you're worshiping a fish, that is worshiping something which is not God. Okay? And if you're worshiping a dog, that is worshiping something which is not God. That is an act of idolatry. But on the other hand, you could have the worship of God as falsely understood. Because for almost everybody, they understand certain things of God that are true. So let's say I understood God is just, God is merciful, God is triune, God became incarnate in our Lord Jesus Christ. These are various things I can understand of God that are true. But then there are various things I can understand of God that are false. Let's say if somebody thought that God sent Muhammad as a prophet, or that, I don't know, I don't like saying these things because a lot of them are very blasphemous, so I just don't like saying them, okay? But you can understand. False understandings of God. Because of this is the doctrine of the Scholastics. So whether you can get your head around it or understand it or not, I'm just stating this as a doctrine to illustrate. Because God is simple, due to the simplicity of God, when it comes to an understanding or conception of God, you can't have a false conception of the true object. This is the idea of the Scholastics. So when it comes to a man, let's say I thought Hassan was white. If I thought Hassan was white, Hassan is not white, okay? This would be a false understanding of the object. But due to the simplicity of God, and St. Thomas, he states this in a number of different places, Summa Contra Gentiles, his commentary on John 4, Summa Theologiae, states in a number of different places, when you form a false conception about God in direct intentional acts, so acts of the intellect towards that thing, well, really acts motivated by the will towards that thing, so like a prostration, a prayer, whatever thing, that is actually what we call an imaginary being. So you have formulated in your intellect of this simple form a false conception. So God is very unlike creatures in this way. You're not having false conceptions and being able to have this be of the true God. So we split every person. We can split him into all of the different intentional acts that he makes. Whether you agree with this or not, I'm just giving you the doctrine of the Scholastics, okay? Don't blame me, blame them. When it comes to each individual person, when they have a false understanding of God, in direct and intentional act towards a false understanding of God, they would say that this is an act of idolatry because it is directed towards a false being. So with the Samaritans, they had various different false understandings of God. The Samaritans, the reason why they thought that they had to worship on their mountain is because they thought that God was bodily and local. They thought that God hung out in like a bodily local way in their mountain. That's why our Lord made the clarification of the worship of spirit and truth. So not only did the Samaritans, we're going to see a text from, I think, 2 Kings 17 that the authors bring up, not only did they mingle the worship of God with idols, they mingled the worship of God. So sometimes they may have a true understanding of God, God as creator, God as the sender of the prophet Moses, et cetera, et cetera. They have certain true understandings of God, and therefore they can have acts of worship towards him. But they also at other times have false understandings of God. And when they have these false understandings of God, they're directing them towards a mental being. Okay? So that right there, that first part right there is an act of idolatry, whether it's a mental being, so a false understanding of God, or a real being, so a creature, a fish, a dog, whatever. But that is completely different. These authors are going to all bring it up. We're also going to see a falsehood when it comes to divine institution as well. And this is something that's going to very clearly show that St. Thomas and basically every other author is going to disagree with the diamonds, because they distinguish between idolatry and the superstition. So superstition consists in worship of the true God. So you actually have the worship of God and the worship of true God. This is not done by divine institution. So what does this mean? Well, basically, there is a certain cultus. So what is a cultus? A cultus is basically like a set of religious institutions. You have a set of prescribed law, like laws of obedience. You have prescribed laws of worship. You have to do it in this way. You have to do it in that way. That is what a cultus is. So, for example, it's kind of funny because we usually we're thinking of worship, and when Vatican II is going to talk about worship, and when St. Gregory VII is going to talk about worship, and when all of the different authors that I'm going to quote, preconciliar authors, are going to talk about worship, sometimes they're going to mean it in one of two ways. Sometimes they're talking about the intentional act. So I pray, I bow, I sing. Those are acts which are ordered or acts which are commanded by the will towards a certain object. So when we're talking about we worship the true God, we're basically saying, do we have the proper object in that intentional act? That's the question we're asking. And that's the question which is being answered by the conciliar, post-conciliar, and preconciliar texts. So that's kind of, we can think about that as worship in terms of a verb. What are you doing? Who are you doing it towards? So, for example, let's say I am driving on the highway. I'm driving on the highway, in my car. I'm driving. That's the action. But then you have what you can call the rules of the road, right? The rules of the road, that is what you're supposed to be doing. Those are the different, not only laws, but also conventional acts that are supposed to be done while you're driving down the road. We can think about the rules of the road as distinct from driving. The rules of the road are almost like an institution of different laws and customs that surround that act of driving. This is kind of the relationship between cultus, and worship. So cult and worship, so we think of worship latria, like an act of worship, right? We think about the difference between an act of worship and a cult is the distinction between something as an act and then all of those rules of the road. So all of the institutions and customs which surround that act. So when it comes to superstition is not concerned exactly with whether the act exists in the soul or not, because it's presupposed. Because there has to be an act if we're going to, call it some sort of species of sin. What else would it be? So there's an act of worship, but it is done outside of the order of those institutions established by God. So it's true insofar as it is an act of worship, and towards God, it's false insofar as it is not in accordance with that cultus. So in accordance with the divinely established institutions. Okay? That distinction right there, so we can think about worship as a verb, as an act, and worship as a noun for all of those institutions which are established by God on earth. That's a very, very important distinction to understand. So when it comes to anybody outside of the Catholic faith, when it comes to Protestants, so when it comes to heretics, when it comes to schismatics, when it comes to those of false religions, okay? And actually that word false religion right there even indicates what I'm about to say. All of these are committing acts, at least materially, of superstition, because they are acting and they are worshiping God in a way that is not in accordance with the divine institution, in accordance with those laws and customs that God has established upon earth. So St. Thomas, when he's talking about the distinction of idolatry and superstition, he talks about the Jews. This is very interesting, the point that he brings up the Jews. And this completely destroys Brother Diamond's entire reading of St. Thomas on this point. Because he brings up the Jews, and what he says about the Jews is that they're committing acts of superstition because they are worshiping God outside of the divinely established cultus. So what does this mean? This means that act, so remember driving in our analogy, that act is towards God. So it's not an act of idolatry. He never accuses the Jews in these texts of idolatry. But he does accuse them of superstition. Because what are they doing? They are engaging in acts. They're engaging in customs and laws of the old law. So they're in the oldness of the old law, but it's directing those acts towards God. So they're committing acts of superstition outside of the divine institutions. So how could they be accused of mere superstition if they were not worshiping God outside of the customs of what we can call the true cultus, which, that's the way in which we can speak about this. The true worship, obviously not as indicating whether or not the act is there, but the true worship is whether you are in line with the divinely instituted cultus. And the false worship has to do not with whether the act is present or not, which is what the magisterial documents are discussing, but with whether it's in accordance with the divine institutions. Okay? Does this make sense? I'm trying to frame this as broadly as possible because I understand that when it comes to a very simplistic reading of a lot of these texts, it can just seem like these authors are contradicting themselves left and right. Because what you'll get on the one hand is they'll be saying, oh, they are truly worshiping God. They're worshiping the God of the Israelites. They're worshiping the God in which they know from nature. And then on the other hand, though, they're like, oh, yes, they're worshiping idols. They're falsely worshiping God, et cetera, et cetera. You'll get these, what seems to be in contradiction with one another. But if you make all those distinctions, then it makes perfect sense. So these are some of the texts that I brought up from Lapide, mostly from commentary on John 4 and then the commentary on Acts 17. He says they, that is the Samaritans, partly followed the Jewish religion, for they worship the God of Israel. Can you say that, Brother Diamond? Did they worship the God of Israel? You would say no. For they worship the God of Israel together with the Assyrian idols. So they had, at one point, they had the worship of God, but alongside God, they brought a lot of idols. And this is the teaching of 2 Kings 17, which the other exegetes will bring out. So for all those people, by the way, who they don't read the Old Testament very closely, because in the Old Testament, all these distinctions that I brought forward, this just comes from Scripture, especially in the Old Testament, because we see people giving defective worship to God. We see people worshiping God and then worshiping idols alongside God. We see people worshiping false gods and therefore being idolaters and not worshiping the true God. We even see people worshiping a false god who they attribute to being the true God, the golden calf situation. What we have is all these distinctions just come from sacred scripture. And then continuing on the second quote, ye worship God together with your Assyrian idols, and associating God, as it were, with idols, you worship a false or fictitious God. So what are the false and fictitious God? The idols, right? Continuing, that this unknown God was true, so he explicitly says it's true, that this unknown God was true, not some false one from among the gods of the Gentiles, Paul suggests. And then he quotes, I think, Romans 1. Another quote, while they worshipped the unknown God, they worshipped the simulacra of the Gentiles and made them equal to him. And then St. Thomas, they adored along with him certain idols. Who are they adoring? They're adoring God. Who are they adoring alongside God? Certain idols. St. John Chrysostom, quoted by St. Thomas. St. John Chrysostom is actually going to be the classic commentator on this, as we will see. They mingled the worship of God with the worship of idols. All these are very clear, right? But unfortunately, what you'll get from the diamonds is they will obfuscate these very clear texts. They'll obfuscate these clear texts and point to statements like their worship is false. Again, in the sense of cultists, of course, obviously. Or one could say in the sense of the mode in which they're worshiping God. Obviously. That's true. And it does not at all contradict what they say in other places. That's the power of synthesis. Okay, you got to synthesize text. You can't be placing texts against each other and assume that an author is just contradicting themselves 5 times in a paragraph. Okay, now I want to explain a little bit more detail with a few more texts, the Thomistic view. I've already explained it a little bit in the monologuing, but let's get into this a little bit closer. Okay, so this is what Cardinal Cajetan says. He says, and this is quoting Summa Theologiae, Secunda Secundae, question 10, article 3. A lot of people misunderstand this text. And they misunderstand this text because they say that somebody who has a false notion of God in no way has a true understanding of God. So how are people going to read that? And he actually deals explicitly with the objection. People read this and they say, oh, well, if anybody gets anything wrong about God, then they don't in any way know God, as specifically the person that they're thinking of. That's never what St. Thomas says. Specifically, St. Thomas is not talking about the person. He's talking about the act. So the act, he's saying that that person in no way comes to understand God by a false act. Whereas with us, among creatures, with composite things, there actually is a certain way in which we can come to know things about something through a false understanding of that object. So this is what Cajetan says, quote, "It is one thing to speak of an unbeliever as such, so as a person, and another to speak of a person who, though an unbeliever, possesses some other kind of knowledge. The text does not say that an unbeliever has no knowledge of God at all, which is what the objection assumes. Rather, it says that through unbelief, so through the act, God is not known, neither absolutely nor in any partial sense. Thus, in every case, it is evident that a false statement as such provides no knowledge of its subject, but rather replaces it with an opposite notion." End quote. And this would be the idea of when we have false notions of God, that intentional acts based on these false notions are actually directed towards an imaginary object. So this is a certain form of idolatry that is different than the worshiping of a creature. Well, it is a creature insofar as it's created by our intellects, but a creature as in, like moving things or angels or whatever else. So to explain this further, we can go into the distinction between superstition and idolatry. I've mentioned this before, but superstition occurs when, quote, anything false is signified by outward worship, especially when someone gives worship to God contrary to the manner established by the church or divine authority. And this is especially true of the Jews. They offer worship to God, quote, to make use of the ceremonies of the old law. This is especially true of the Jews, and by the same reasoning, true of the Muslims and others as well, heretics and apostate. Well, not necessarily apostates, but heretics and schismatics. So this is distinct from idolatry. He says, quote, accordingly, the species of superstition are differentiated first on the part of the mode, so the mode or the manner in which worship is done. Second, on the part of the object, that which it is directed towards. So this distinction between mode and object, that is that distinction between object and cultist that I brought up earlier. So when it comes to the object, if you're worshiping a dog, that is an object which is different from God, obviously, and you're an idolater. But if you have the object correct, you're worshiping God as he's known by nature, divine revelation, however other means you know God. But the mode is wrong. So you're worshiping not in accordance with the divine institution, that is the Catholic religion, which is necessary for salvation. If you're not worshiping him in accordance with that, then that's an act of superstition. That's what he means by mode. For the divine worship may be given either to whom it ought to be given, namely to the true God, but in an undue mode. And notice he specifically mentions the Jews, those who worship according to the old law when it comes to this. And this is the first species of superstition, or to whom it ought not to be given, namely to any creature whatsoever. And this is another genus of superstition, divided into many species in respect to the various ends of divine worship, etc. So now to provide that synthesis right there, to kind of explain things before we get into all those texts, I got you guys a bunch of texts. Sorry for being very yappy. I'm just trying to make sure I explain everything. So, true and perfect worship requires, one, correct knowledge of God, and two, the divine institution for worship. Correct knowledge of God, divine institution for worship. Don't have correct knowledge, it's an act of idolatry. Don't have divine institution, it's an act of superstition. For number one, and I'm going to distinguish on this one, number one, for the correct knowledge of God, what concerns us is the intentional act, not the subject. So it's the intentional act of unbelief, not the unbeliever that we're talking about right here, just as Cajetan distinguishes. And then we have superstitious worship. Superstitious worship of God has a correct knowledge of God without divine institution, so the incorrect cultus. So this would be Muslims, Jews, heretics, etc. They do not have the true cultus. They do not have the divine establishment for their worship. So what we're going to see actually is that many of the theologians who are going to acknowledge that the act of worship is directed towards the true God are going to say that Jews or Muslims or whoever have given up the true cultus of God and therefore are said to be offering false worship. We'll get that. But not false worship in the same sense as when we're talking about driving. If you are not following the rules of the road, you're driving falsely. Doesn't mean you're not driving. It means you're doing it wrong. Okay? So, and then you have idolatrous worship. Idolatrous worship is false both as to the mode and as to the object. So this is the furthest you can get from true worship. So you can worship a false god either in having a false intention about God or by worshiping a creature. And then what you have is you can have the same person. We see this all throughout the Old Testament. We see this in the Samaritans themselves. Okay? When it comes to the Samaritans, they are going to mix a multitude of these sins. Okay? So the same person can worship God in a superstitious way and can worship idols, and therefore commit idolatry. And the same person can actually go and worship the true God in the correct way, obviously repenting of the falsehood of their other acts. But the same person can move between these acts, right? There's nothing contradictory in these notions. We see this all throughout the Old Testament. So now let's look at the magisterial declarations, because I want to bring up a famous letter from St. Gregory VII. And I also want to bring up the letter from Pius II that gets frequently quoted from the Diamonds, because we'll see that this distinction between adoration and cultus is going to be very important, between the act of worship and then the institutions of worship, if we may. So this is from the letter of Pope St. Gregory VII. Almost everybody's heard this before, but there are people who haven't heard it. So I'm going to read it anyway. Pope from the 11th century, writing to a Muslim king. This is what he says. Almighty God, who desires that all men shall be saved and that no one should perish, approves nothing more highly in us than this, that a man love his fellow man next to his God, and do nothing to him that he would not that others should do to himself. This affection we and you owe to each other in a more peculiar way than the people of other races, because, and he's talking to a Muslim, because we worship and confess the same God, though in diverse forms, and daily praise and adore him as the creator and ruler of this world. End quote. So this is, I believe, although there might be earlier statements on the Jews, I would have to check. I would have to check it out. Off the top of my head, I can't think of an earlier statement. This is really the earliest statement that gives a very definitive description on this point. So now kind of getting to the objection from Pius II. So the Diamonds, they will frequently quote Pope Pius II's Vocavit Nos. This is what the text says. And I gave the little Latin text right there just so you can see the underlying text. Because this is, I believe, I used the translation that they use in their video. I believe this is a translation that they themselves uniquely gave. So he says that the Muslims, quote, now call upon the horrid and abominable name of Muhammad, and abandoning the worship of the true God, and imbued with unspeakable rites, observe obscene ceremonies, end quote. So they will interpret this phrase, abandoning the worship of the true God. And the way that they will interpret this is to say that the object of their worship is now something else rather than the true God. So they will interpret this in terms of the act of worship or the object of worship. So the act or object are somehow non-existent or directed towards something other than God. But what we actually see from the text, when we're looking at the description, the underlying text, this is referring not to the act itself or the object of the act. It's actually referring to the cultus. It's referring to that establishment of various different rites. When you actually read the paragraph of the entire text, I should have gave it here, but I didn't. But you can see it from the text itself. Unspeakable rites, obscene ceremonies. Now they call upon the horrid and abominable name. When you look at the whole paragraph, it previously mentions, okay, this is what they were doing. They were chanting psalms unto God. They were building churches. They were offering the Eucharistic sacrifice. All of these institutions of the institution of the true God, the cultus of the true God, as instituted by divine authority. And they've given up this cultus and they've replaced it with a different cultus. So what is he accusing them of when they're replacing the cultus of divine institution with something else? They're accusing them of superstition. There's nothing here to indicate that this is actually talking about a change in the object of worship or somehow an absence of the act itself. Rather, he's accusing them of superstition, just as we would accuse the Jews of the old law of superstition. Okay, so this is completely in line with what we've said. We can actually also look at other texts from Pius. Maybe you're not convinced by that. We can also look at other texts of Pius II, which are going to confirm this. So there's two texts in particular. There's other texts as well that we can look into. But I wanted to make this snappy. I wanted to make this quick. So first we have the letter to Mehmed II. We judge that you confess and believe in our God, who created the earth and who cares for everything he fashioned in the world. End quote. And this is not my translation. It's Albert R. Baca. This is his translation. That you confess and believe in our God, or some say the one God. There's a little bit of a textual variation right there. And then we also have from an oration, the Saracens who follow Muhammad have been deceived by this false teacher and err in many ways. Still, they agree with truth insofar as they reject the notion of many gods and profess that all things are governed by the one God. So again, we have the same notion. So we can look at his other texts. We can look at the text itself. We can look at previous magisterial declarations. We can look at all of the exegetes which surrounded him. But let's go into some of those exegetes, because I have 7 different authors. I did it across various different ages. And we're even going to see that one author goes so far as to provide a very interesting, I would say that I would even be uncomfortable with speaking about this, it in this high of a way. I would be uncomfortable with it, although I don't think he said anything necessarily wrong. So this is what St. John Chrysostom says in homily 33 on John. He says, quote, how then did the Samaritans know not what they worshipped? Because they thought that God was local and partial. So at least they served him. And so they sent to the Persians and reported that the God of this place is angry with us, in this respect forming no higher opinion of him than of their idols. Wherefore they continued to serve both him and devils. What do we have right there? The Samaritans, they served 2 masters. They served him, that is, the true God. They also served devils, served demons. They served their idols. Joining things which ought not to be joined. They're joining things which ought not to be joined, not removing one thing and replacing with another thing. The Jews, on the contrary, were free from this supposition, at least the greater part of them, and knew that he was God of the world. Therefore, he says, you worship ye know not what. We know what we worship. Do not wonder that he numbers himself among Jews, for he speaks to the woman's opinion of him, as though he were a Jewish prophet, and therefore he puts we worship. For that he is of the objects of worship is clear to everyone, because to worship belongs to the creature, but to be worshipped to the Lord of the creature. End quote. So that's St. John Chrysostom. And I want to move on to Saint Cyril of Alexandria. He says, quote, he speaks again as a Jew and as a man, since the economy of the matter in hand demands now too this mode of speaking. For Christ would not have missed meet opportunity. Yet does he attribute something more in respect of understanding to the worship of the Jews? For the Samaritans worship God simply and without search. But the Jews, having received through the law and the prophets the knowledge of him who is, as far as they were able. Therefore he says that the Samaritans know not, but that the Jews have good knowledge, of whom he affirms that salvation shall be received, that is, himself. So we see that the Samaritans worship God simply and without search. So in a defective way, but it's still present. And then we have now getting into the medieval exegetes. We have Hugh of St. Cher and St. Bonaventure. So here's what Hugh says, and this is in his Postia, or is that it's Postia. Quote, "You Samaritans worship what you do not know. That is, you indeed worship God." So the object is there. But from the very manner, and this is ex modo, this is the same language. And remember, Hugh of St. Cher, by the way, interesting fact, Hugh of St. Cher is actually a 13th century Dominican. Do you know who else is a 13th century Dominican? St. Thomas. There's close connections, actually, between Hugh of St. Cher, he was a cardinal of the church, and St. Thomas Aquinas. So he's making this distinction between you indeed worship God, so the object of worship, and then from the very manner, ex modo, the very manner of worshiping. This is the cultus right there. He's explaining very clearly superstition. So when he uses whatever way he describes this, we already have his explanation theologically. But from the very manner of worshiping, you show that you do not know him, because they thought him to be a local and particular God, and not the ruler of the whole world. And thus they worshipped him, namely in a particular place or in a mountain, as if he did not have the same power of hearing elsewhere. Or, and he's giving a second possible reading, you worship what you do not know because you worship idols together with God. Together with God. What does that mean? I don't know. What could it possibly mean? Who knows? Or because you do not receive the prophets sent by God, but only the law. End quote. So Hugh of St. Cher, very clear. Now let's go to St. Bonaventure. St. Bonaventure, he says, you worship what you do not know, since you do not have the law. Furthermore, you worship both gods and idols and believe that God is a local deity. 2 Kings 17 says of the Samaritans that they serve the God of the earth and their idols. What does that say? I don't know. What could it possibly mean? Who knows? Then we have Blessed Denis of Carthusian, one of my favorites, 15th century Carmelite. Oh, Carthusian, sorry. Quote, I always think Carmelites with the Samontechenses because they're my favorites. Quote, you Samaritans worship what you do not know, for they worshipped God, the creator of all things. Interesting. Whom they did not know. That is, they thought badly and falsely about him. So they worshipped God, the creator of all things. And when we say they don't know him, we're saying that they thought badly about him, thinking God to be corporeal, circumscribed, and fashioned with bodily ligaments. They also worshipped idols, which they did not know, thinking some divinity was present in them, which were full of demons. So not only did they worship God, the creator of all things, they also worshipped idols. Now Cardinal Cajetan. And Cardinal Cajetan, he gives, I think, the most extensive explanation. I've learned the most from him. This is actually a different place than the one that I normally quote. This is actually from his commentary on John, because he wrote a series of biblical commentaries. Quote, after the same exclusion of places, Jesus adds the difference between true and perfect adoration. So that's actually where I brought in the language of true and perfect adoration. So we're talking about true and perfect adoration. Those who worship God in a way that is not ex modo, so from the manner in which God has instituted it, that's not true and perfect adoration. So in that way, of course, we could say that they're offering false worship. We're talking about the very act itself, which is present, just in a false mode. After the same exclusion of places, Jesus adds the difference between true and perfect adoration insofar as regards knowledge, preferring the Jews to the Samaritans, in this, that the Samaritans adore not knowing the thing adored. In their knowledge, they adored one God alone. There you go. Creator of heaven and earth. So this is what they have knowledge of. So they're making correct intentional acts insofar as they adore the one God alone, insofar as they adore him as creator of heaven and earth. But the Samaritans indeed adored the same God. They indeed adored the same God, yet did not know with certain faith. So they did not know. And actually, there's a text from Dominus Jesus that I really like to bring up with this. Faith, therefore, as a gift of God, as a supernatural virtue infused by him, involves a dual adherence to God, who reveals into the truth which he reveals, out of the trust which one has in him who speaks. For this reason, the distinction between theological faith and a certain kind of belief in the other religions must be firmly held. So theological faith only implies the acceptance of the truth of Christ's revelation, guaranteed by God, who is truth itself. So therefore, outside of Catholic Church, there's not faith. There's only a certain kind of belief. Anyways, I just like that connection. Yet they did not know with certain faith that he alone was the true God. For they also adored other gods, and together with other gods, also the God of Israel. What is that supposed to mean? Hence, they neither knew nor believed the true God, but in a certain confused way, they adored him as they did other gods, as though he were the God of that land, as is evident from 2 Kings 17. And therefore, it is most true to say, you adore what you do not know, because salvation is from the Jews. This reason shows that the discourse was about the knowledge of faith. This is how Cardinal Cajetan specifically interprets it. Is when he says you do not know, he's obviously not talking about in a absolute sense, since they knew him from various different means as creator of heaven and earth, knew him as the one God, the God of Israel, etc. Knew him under all these aspects, but he says, well, this discourse is about the knowledge of faith. Therefore, we could say that he didn't know him, or that they didn't believe in the true God because they didn't have faith. For the salvation that is from the Jews is salvation from faith in the one God, which began among the Jews and is propagated from them. End quote. Okay, and then here's Benito Arias Montano. This is in his commentary on Malachi 1:11. This is what I think is the clearest one, and I'm going to finish off with this. And after this, I'll answer all of the super chats, okay? This is what he says, quote, "For it matters greatly whether what is done is known to be according to the counsel of divine will." So this is right here from the divine institution. "For it matters greatly whether what is done is known to be according to the counsel of divine will, or according to one's own judgment and opinion, or some ancient custom, without certain knowledge of the things and of the divine will." So we have these two different groups. You have the worship which is done in accordance with the divine will and intention expressly stated in divine revelation, and that is the true and perfect worship of God. And then on the other hand, we have the worship of God, which is done from traditions or one's own will, or whatever other uncertain way it may be. Okay, these are the two types of worship that he is bringing forward, which we've already discussed in a number of different ways. As it is written, you adore what you do not know. We adore what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But what is commended among the nations to the shame and severe rebuke of the Jews is this, that the Gentiles, to whom the divine will and command regarding sacrifices and the worship of him were not manifest from a certain precept of the law, or clearly known from the oracles of their neighbors. Nevertheless, whatever right here, Brother Diamond, make sure you confess this loud and clear for everyone. Nevertheless, revered and observed him by whatever name they knew God, and as far as they could attain by thought and reasoning, devoutly worshipped him. Vatican II. What is this Vatican II nonsense going on? What is this Vatican II nonsense? Devoutly worshipped him. I know I'm kind of uncomfortable with using language like that sometimes because I think it can give the wrong idea. But what's going on? That is, they honored the supreme mover and first cause of causes from the rising of the sun to its setting under the great name of God, august and holy. I actually think we need to go a little bit more into the exegetical traditional Malachi 1, because I see people bring up the text from the book of Acts. They bring up Romans 10. They bring up John 4. But Malachi 1, I think we could do some cooking on this, because they say stuff like this. They're like, the Jews were put to shame by some of the devout worship of the Gentiles. And then he quotes back to John 4 and says, yeah, it's the same idea as what's going on here. Interesting, isn't it, boys? Okay, so I'm going to get into the super chats right about 50 minutes. And then I hope that you guys enjoyed this. I hope that I at least made what is unfortunately sometimes a very boring, a very dry topic. I hope that I explained in a synthetic way that you can come to understand more about our most holy religion and the veracity and the eminence of the great, holy, and most divine Second Vatican Council in perfect continuity with all tradition before it. No question, just donating so you can keep dunking on the MHFM cult. Also consider checking out Diamond Data. What is Diamond Data? Let me see. Diamond Data. Is that something on like a YouTube channel, or let me see. See if it's like a YouTube channel or Diamond Data YouTuber overview. Oh, so it's a YouTube channel. Huh. Okay, Diamond Data. Oh, so it's somebody who did a bunch of videos against Vatican Catholic 4 or 5 years ago. Interesting. I've never heard of this. Okay, thank you for the recommendation. Money. Thank you, Colin. I don't like it when Mom Wagner and Dad Michael Diamond. Oh, okay. I have no beef with Michael. I'm only beefing with Peter. Okay. And why my mom, Jerome? Why my mom? Can Catholics watch horror movies? I'm scared. I'm scared to answer this now that the Diamonds are watching right now. I don't really watch movies. A lot of movies, and this is W Diamond for bringing this up. Sometimes a lot of movies, they have a lot of very sacrilegious and very inappropriate, especially sexually inappropriate material that I obviously don't want to be watching. So I don't really watch movies. Actually, I don't do that. Somebody wants to sit down and watch a movie for like 2 hours. Dog, I just sit down and I go on Twitter for 2 hours and I flame people and I delete all of it the next morning. That's much more fun. It's much more fun to do than watching a movie. Just arguing with people on Twitter. Because they never understand what I say though. What's the difference between idols and wrongly positing something as the true God? You refer to the golden calf as the latter. That's not no. It is. It is. This is what a lot of people. Okay. So this is the way in which the Diamonds also misunderstood what I was saying. You know what happens? Although I did spend a few minutes explaining it, so sorry, man, I can't let you off the hook. You're on the hook for this one, okay, buddy? So when it comes to the way in which a lot of people describe this, they basically have this idea, and this is not the idea of the Scholastics, okay? They have this idea, and basically, if you kind of have this common notion of God, and you apply it to whatever the frick you feel like, okay? Whatever you feel like. You apply it to a dishwasher. You apply it to the grass outside. You apply it to a tree or a golden calf. You apply it to a pink unicorn. This is actually Sam Shamoon got caught in this with, what is his name? I can't remember his name. Sam Shamoon got caught with this with somebody. Cleaved Antiquity. They will say that as long as you have this common notion, you're directing it to whatever, that kind of counts. Kind of counts as having an act of worship towards God. It's really weird. There's a lot of people like Michael Lofton saying this about like freaking Vishnu and stuff. It's kind of gross, actually. Saying this about Baal is actually if you have worship towards Baal and you really intend it to be about God, that you're actually worshiping God when you're worshiping Baal. It's terrible. But we don't believe that. The Scholastic tradition does not believe that. The Scholastic tradition believes that due to the simplicity of God, only when you have a correct intention about God, only like insofar as God is creator, first mover, etc., those correct intentions, making acts of the will based on those correct intentions, directing them towards God, that terminates in God as an object. This doesn't necessarily mean it's in accordance with the divine institution of worship. Doesn't necessarily mean that the mode is proper. Does not necessarily mean that. It still could be an act of superstition. But this is still an act of worship, properly speaking. It's just like the driving example. This is still driving. You're still driving. But if you're, that would be like saying if I intend to drive and I get on a bike and I start riding the bike, then I'm driving a car. No, you're not. Okay. So that's the distinction that's being made. So when it comes to the golden calf was an idol. They were committing idolatry by worshiping the golden calf. Even though they were saying that this was the one true God, that doesn't matter. They were worshiping a golden calf. This is distinct from what happens throughout the prophetic books. And we see in the prophetic books, we see generally two different types of people. On the one hand, you have besides the pious Israelites, of course, You had the one hand, you had people who were offering defective worship to God. These were the people offering the lame lambs and such to God. These were acts of superstition. They were sinfully worshiping. They were causing sinful acts of worship, right? They were wrong with this. They were sinning with this. Then you had also people who were mixing the worship of God with the worship of foreign gods. Like you can think of Solomon, for example. He was going to the temple, praying to God, but he was also going home and doing all of that stuff as well. He was a syncretist. I guess not really a syncretist, more like a pluralist. A syncretist would assume that they're mixing the worship of one into the other. So that person is kind of like the Samaritans, they had their worship of God, and they also mixed it with the worship of idols. So no, the worship of the golden calf, that was an act of idolatry. Fire video, thank you, I appreciate it. Okay, if part of referencing the true God is him being the progenitor of creation, doesn't worshiping other gods alongside him automatically invalidate that? No, it's because when it comes to these other gods, they would just think that in a very idiotic way. Obviously, we would know. They would just think of these gods as somehow created gods, which is, again, really stupid, but they would just call them gods and offer them worship. The idiocy of the Gentiles. Okay, so that's all that I have. I hope that you have a Oh, Vatican Catholic. How are you, buddy? I hope that you enjoyed this entire video. I hope you watched it. I hope that you came to understand how awesome this video is. So, one, if you remember, I hope that you read my original tweet, but I also put it in here just in case you didn't. Or maybe you're Michael and not Peter. I don't know who runs the Twitter and who runs the Vaticano. Okay, so you're doing some Latink stuff in my comment section. This is fun. But if you read the commentary and read the part where St. Thomas says that they mixed the worship of God with idols. That's one right there. Okay. You explicitly quoted it in your own quotation, St. Thomas. I don't know how you missed this. It's not that hard to read, right? Maybe you're having a hard time because you're Vaticano Catholico, okay? Maybe you can't read English that well. Maybe you're, you can't speak English. Maybe the Latinx version takes over this week, so you weren't able to read. Happens to the best of us, okay? I appreciate the Hispanic ministry. Maybe you should apply to your local Novus Ordo. You can be ahead of the Spanish ministry there. But beside that, you can look to the sections that I referenced on idolatry and superstition. And in the sections on idolatry and superstition, St. Thomas, he talks about how those who are practicing the old law, these individuals, even while they are worshiping God, and their object of worship is kept, the mode of worship is distinct. And because the mode of worship is distinct, they're committing acts of superstition because it's not in accordance with the divine institution of the Catholic religion. He says it's about practitioners of the old law. And in the third place, you can also look at the text from St. John Chrysostom that St. Thomas explicitly quotes that I gave in my original post on this matter. Okay. And if you want, you could just read like every single scholastic ever commenting on this text. Well, not specifically the commentary on John 4. There's not like there's scholastics commenting on scholastic commentaries on scripture. You can look at, for example, the commentary on Secunda Secundae, Article 10, Question 10, Article 3. The scholastics comment on this, and they explain it exactly how I explain it. Now you explain it. These guys read St. Thomas their whole lives. This was their jobs. They exegeted him all day. Okay. So, hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, Brother Diamond. I'll be thinking about you. I hope you get back your English language account. That would be fun. Okay. Love you. And as always, God bless.